You are here with us at Land Justice Futures for our Power Hour conversation here at the end of the year with Elizabeth Garlow and Morgan Curtis, centered on where do we ethically put money? How do we resource a just transition? Today, we'll be talking about how to limit the harm naturally reproduced by capitalism, how to invest in the solidarity economy and the world we need, and how to redistribute resource to where it's needed and owed through reparations. It's been a minute since we've hosted one of these, so by way of just greeting each other and greeting this moment, just want to name, we are living in precarious times, and however these times are moving you or impacting you, we just want to acknowledge that. These are certainly times that illuminate the polycrisis of this era. We are seeing a new Gilded Age in which more and more of the world's wealth is hoarded by fewer and fewer people. We are seeing the climate catastrophe wreak havoc in the global south, but also here in the global north. We are seeing multiple genocides, land grabs, power grabs, the plunder of the collective by oligarchs and corporations. And we are seeing governments fall and governments move towards fascism, seeking greater and greater control over land and communities. And we are seeing people rise up also. That is true. So it might feel scary to name, but we are in an era of collapse, which also means an era of transformation. Pope Francis calls this time not an era of change, but a change of era, and it is certainly feeling that way. And personally, this can feel really overwhelming. Like I certainly feel that. So that's part of why we're hosting this conversation. It begs the question, what can we do? What can we anchor in? How can we use whatever it is that we have to move towards the healing of what ails us, to invest our time and resources in collective safety and well-being, collective belonging and dignity? Our advisor, Pat McCabe, was talking to me the other day and had mentioned, when collapse is here, what we will have is the land and the earth and all she brings. We will have our prayers, our songs, our stories, our culture, and we will have each other. That'll be what we got to work with. And, as often is quoted from, I believe, Korean Osage people and others, we cannot eat money. But for now, and for who knows how long, money is currency. It is relevant, and it can still make things happen. Can build things, procure things, channel human creativity and labor. And as Pat also likes to talk about, it's a currency that is widespread and therefore is energy that can be directed in ways that support life rather than destroy it. So we can still unlock a lot through the potential of our potential through money right now, and it's a matter of our will to use it that way. So that is what we're going to be talking about today with Elizabeth and Morgan. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to spotlight you both so that we can see your faces. There we go. And yes, hello. So Elizabeth and Morgan, you work predominantly with white wealth-holding communities to take ethical and moral responsibility for the resources they currently control. And I'm just so grateful to be having this conversation at the end of the year when a lot of people are like making plans, thinking about how they use their resources. I'd love for you both to just introduce yourselves a little bit and your work, who you work with, and we'll get started.
I can go. Sure. Yay. Good morning, everyone. Hi, my name's Morgan Curtis. I recently hung all my ancestors on the wall behind me, so I'm really excited to be having this Zoom background for the first time. And I'll speak to, I'm coming here from a lineage of settler colonialism. I'm coming here from a lineage of investment bankers. I'm coming here from a lineage of people that love to roast lambs on birthdays. I'm coming here from a lineage of skiers and people with big laughs and people who didn't raise me to question many of the assumptions around why my family had so much while others had so little. And it was my kind of journey of coming to recognize the histories that put my family into that place of privilege that brings me to this work today. It was my time in social movements as a youth organizer when my fellow young people, mostly young people of color, would say to me, well, what are you doing with your people? And my own resistance to looking at who my people really were for a long time, being like, I tried to get away from that weird world that I came from. But ultimately seeing that if there was work to do for me for liberation, that it would involve going back to get my people and to admit that we were worth going back for and to learn to love those parts of myself enough, even though so many parts of our histories have entangled us with violence and the legacies of this country. And so that work for me has looked like organizing, coaching, facilitating, working with mostly white, wealthy people, thinking about redistribution and reparations. And that was work that I was invited into in many ways by the climate justice organizing spaces that I was in as a young person. Particularly shouts out to the fossil fuel divestment movement that got me thinking about investing for the first time. And also a shout out to Canticle Farm, which is the interfaith intentional community that I call home here in Ohlone Territory, Oakland, California. So I'm shaped by all these things I just named and grateful to be here with you all and to dive into this conversation.
So good to be in shared space with you, Morgan and Sarah, and everyone here. What a gift. I'm Elizabeth Garlow, and as I was preparing for our time together today, I had this memory come back to me when I was 11 years old, and it was Christmas, and money was really tight in our family, and our neighbors sort of surprised us by gathering baskets of goods and put them on our doorstep. And I remember at 11 years old, really internalizing this sense that our true wealth, our genuine wealth, is in our relationships and in how we show up for each other. And there's this quote from Charles Eisenstein that I often go back to, which is that the more you give, the richer you are, the wealth of relationships, gratitude, and connection. And I think that longing to be situated inside the wealth of relationships ironically took me into a career working in money. So I became very interested in a different kind of economic narrative that might animate our lives together. I was an undergraduate student of economics and found it to be very disillusioning to be steeped in neoclassical economic theory and hearing these stories about rational, self-interested people making the world go round. And that's what drew me into, in particular, radical Catholic traditions of economics and studying the cooperative economics tradition and spending some time in Latin America and in Europe, living in cooperatives, working in cooperatives, and understanding the ways that money, as Sarah mentioned so beautifully in the introduction, money could be a currency of energy that could flow to where and when it is needed, so that we can actually experience mutual abundance. Those experiences undergirded my desire to work in the realms of directing money and resources differently. Part of that is also because I had the good fortune of being shaped by the lineages, particularly of the Franciscan charism, as I was growing up, spending a lot of time in Franciscan communities and also with the Sisters of Mercy here in Detroit, and recognized that there were in our faith traditions so many beautiful things to draw upon in terms of the commoning of our resources and the building of our common life together. But when I found myself working in impact investing for a decade, I actually experienced a huge amount of cognitive dissonance. I worked in early stage equity funds. I worked in microfinance. I was working to try and drive capital in the directions it was needed. And yet I continuously encountered this pervasive logic that we needed to have our cake and eat it too, that we needed to do as much good as we can do in the world, but also somehow make as much money as we could still, make. And it really troubled me. And I found myself asking questions like, well, what is enough? Like, what would it mean if we talked about sufficiency? What would it mean if we leaned more radically on each other to figure out what was needed and how to flow the resources to where they're needed? What would it look like if relationships were at the core, at the center of how we thought about those decisions rather than arm's length transaction that sort of others one another? And those questions led me to work for a period of time with the Center for Action and Contemplation, really working with Father Richard Rohr on how contemplative spirituality could animate a different ethic of finance and investment, and helping that organization build a philosophy of money that was rooted in a contemplative consciousness, and then eventually to co-creating what is now called the Francesco Collaborative, which is really rooted in the Economy of Francesco movement that Pope Francis created in 2019 to invite people around the world to think about how we build a different kind of moral economy. And so in that work, we have a community, a robust community of many faith-based organizations, as well as some individuals who are really asking what it means to live into a non-extractive ethic with how we direct our institutional resources and, to some extent, individual resources. And so in that work, I've had the blessing of working with some of you who are on this call. I see some familiar faces, working with a number of women's religious congregations and accompanying them on those questions as well. So super, super happy to be here.
Thank you both. You're just such fonts of wisdom and like really valuable experience. I feel like your introductions are also so informative and like model for us like where we're trying to go. And you both, mentioned the faith communities that you're a part of. I guess I should also mention here that this conversation is going to be a little bit more of a 101 for a general audience, anyone who's holding these questions, and acknowledging that we all three of us actually work in some ways with faith communities, and we'll hope to come back to this conversation in the spring and offer a conversation more specific, perhaps to sisters in religious communities, as those are ones that we at Land Justice Futures work with. But for now, whoever you are and whatever you or your organization's financial situation looks like, we hope that this conversation will help widen all of our perspectives and our sense of options for considering how to resource a just transition or resource the world we need. So just to kind of get started, I offered a little bit of framing around like why this conversation right now. And, as people who work to align people's money with their values, why is this work and this conversation today so important right now, given the moment we're living in? I'm just curious if there's anything you'd like to say or add.
Oh, it's a big, big question. And I think a couple of things I want to reflect on, Sarah. One is I feel like we are super steeped in this narrative that our main job in society is to accumulate wealth and then maybe give some of it away. And we are so stuck in that narrative. And in some ways, right, it's kind of centered on this notion of retirement in a way, like we're going to work, we're going to accumulate, and then we're going to retire. And then maybe we'll have time to do the things that our hearts love and long for or something. As we play into that dominant narrative, we are feeding a system of destruction and degradation. I'm sure we'll get more into this, but there are ways in which the ways that we are both focused on wealth accumulation, and the ways that we are in the places that we are putting those resources into are really feeding an economy of what Pope Francis would call an economy of death, an economy of destruction, not an economy of life. And I think we're living in really interesting times where we have essentially hollowed out. There's this book called Wealth Supremacy by Marjorie Kelly that I think makes a really compelling argument about how this system, our financial system, has hollowed out the real economy, that we actually expect to just make more money on money rather than contributing to the activities that really uphold an economy that is about how we produce and provide for one another. And so in that dynamic, we actually have a system of shareholder capitalism and growing concentration of power and wealth with asset managers, these large non-bank financial institutions that hold a lot of our money. And those institutions are in turn shaping the policies that govern a lot of decisions about our climate, about our lives together. And so we have to be really cognizant of the direction that asset manager sort of power and the concentration of wealth is leading us and impacting our lives. It is not other than us. It is us. Like, it is the system that we are situated inside of. And has led us to a situation here in the United States where the top 10% of earners own 57%, 67% of all wealth in this country. The bottom 50% of earners own 2.5% of all wealth. Like, we just vast inequality that I know we all hear those statistics, but to really sit with and recognize that the economy needs a complete refresh and redesign and rethink in order to get to a life of mutual flourishing, and money plays a huge role in how we think about that redesign.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. I think one thing I would add is just as we're in this political moment where for so many of us, it can feel like political change at like a federal or structural level feels so far away towards the wins we really want to see. I think it's a moment that asks us to look at, okay, well, where do we have power right now? Where do we have power in our institutions? Where do we have power in our communities, in our bank accounts, in our consumer choices, and at all those different scales to look at, well, what can I move right now, even when we're facing a repressive political landscape? And with my participation in those various scales of our economy and culture and community, like, where can I opt out of the systems that I don't believe in and opt into the emerging ones that I want to be resourcing? And I think particularly for those of us who either come from wealth or manage wealth through our roles in organizations, there can be a disempowerment of like, there's so few options, or, you know, someone above me has more control than I do. And to really sit with, like, this is such a crucial moment to be resourcing projects and structures and processes that defend life right now, whether that's the human life that is most impacted by current and coming policies of our government, or the earth and more than human life. And so I see this as a moment for us to be critically reflecting on the choices we can make.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you named one of those choices. In order to get to the choices we want, we also have to opt out of the choices we've been making. We just, had this Mother House Starter series this fall, talking about what does it mean, removing our consent from the domination codes that determine so much of life right now. Can you, and I know that we could spend a semester talking about this question, but can you give a brief overview, just kind of in more like mechanic terms, of how the conventional status quo of where money conventionally or commonly sits and what it's doing and how that is upholding a system of extraction and domination. Whether that's, savings in banks, investments, endowments, the way people, the philanthropic industrial complex is a part of this. There are just some like headlines that can be anchoring for folks as we recognize what it means to opt out of the system that is a death economy.
Yeah, I could jump in from an individual perspective and you could take us from there. Great. So I work one-on-one with wealth inheritors, and one of the things I really support people with is actually just like the basic financial education of, okay, so you have money, you were given money, like where is it? And often I think for people who have wealth but also have social justice values, there's been avoidance of like, oh God, like where even is that password to get into that account, or what was the name of that bank? I don't even want to remember. And once folks, yeah, turn to face what they're holding and just begin to even handhold them through the like, okay, let's Google this bank and be like, how do you feel about where this money is? What choices is this bank making on your behalf? Even just with your checking account, it might look like numbers, dollars on a screen, but that bank behind the scenes is making choices about what your money is up to when you're not using it. And there's a big difference between, let's say, Bank of America financing mountaintop coal removal in West Virginia versus your local credit union helping folks like get a small business loan for the first time. That's a really big difference in terms of what your checking account is making happen in the world. And then we get to maybe there are investment accounts in your name, brokerage accounts, stocks, shares, bonds. So often I think people, especially inheritors, are told like, don't worry about this. Like someone's making these decisions on your behalf and they have your best interest in mind. And the problem is that best interest for so long has been defined solely by, are these numbers going up each year? And not just going up, but at a rate of return that we can expect to be reasonable over a period of time. And most often that does not include any consideration for the impacts of those investments in our society. And so I will ask my clients, what are you not willing to make money from? What are you not willing to resource your life through like making happen in the world? And people often have a really long list. They're like, well, I don't want destruction of the environment to be what's making my life possible. I don't want like poor labor conditions and anti-union efforts against workers to be what's funding my life. I don't want predatory lending and extractive like banking practices for poor folks and in low-income communities to be what's funding my life. And quite quickly, when we take that list and compare it to companies that are publicly traded, that are big enough to be on our stock market, that have chosen that structure that forces them to be more accountable to the shareholders than the communities that they operate in or source from, quite often there's not many of those companies left that pass through the criteria for what people don't want their life to be resourced by. And I was so moved recently, a client of mine, she said, you know what, Morgan, I think that my chronic illness is directly connected to the fact that every aspect of my life is paid for by the suffering of others. That energy that's coming to me, like I don't want it anymore. It's actually not worth it. And that's what we need to opt out of. We need to opt out of the illusion that it's okay for like these huge gears of a destructive, extractive, yeah, illusion that is okay. And it takes courage and creativity and learning, which is why I'm so glad that webinars like this are happening.
Share just a couple of visuals here to help reflect on this part. Morgan spoke so beautifully about each of us as individuals, and I'm going to just maybe reflect a little bit on the organizational dilemma, which I think is actually very similar to any of us who have a retirement account or retirement savings. We're often complicit in a similar system. And that system, we have many sisters on the call today, so you'll recognize this. For others, forgive me, some of this language is a little wonky, but this is often when I'm working with congregations, we often talk about the fact that our kind of temporal goods really are at the service of mission. But the irony is that many of our investments are held directly inside of large companies or mutual funds where there's really zero transparency about what is in those, bundled funds that are directly contributing to much of the devastation that we seek to undo with our ministry and our work. And so this contradiction is everywhere, right? I mean, we are all so steeped inside of this financial system where we have very little awareness about just how complicit we are with extractive investments. And so we often end up in a situation where we take the profits or the returns from these investments and we seek to then fund sponsored ministries or good works or charitable works, et cetera. And I think part of what I invite all of us to really wrestle with is, do those ends really justify these means? Right? I think often the dominant consciousness or the dominant language we use would say that the more money we can grow here, the more we'll have to do good things in the world. But in fact, there is a massive contradiction to reckon with here. And the kind of complicity with this system is precisely what Pope Francis has really called us to see and wrestle with, in particular in Laudato Si and Laudate Deum, his recent letter. So often what this ends up leading to is this question of, okay, how do we then shift what's in these portfolios such that they are part and parcel of this broader ecosystem of ministries that we are seeking to really nurture in the world, right? How do we reconstitute those investment portfolios? And I think each of us on this call today are probably interested in that as an individual too. Well, can we invest our money ethically in our retirement funds, right? And I have some ideas that we can get into on that later. Then I think the next question is, how do we actually put life at the center of how all of these resources are flowing all the time, rather than bifurcating investments from grants, right? As an organization, what if you really were blending all of this together and asking, okay, how is all of this at the service of life and community? And that's where I think we can get into more discussion around, well, what does it mean to really put an ethic of repair at the center of this work? Much more robust discussions. I'll stop there, Sarah, but I think we can also get into maybe some specific ideas for how folks could be engaged in that journey work.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you both for that. I feel like what you're naming, it makes me think of the kind of mechanics often at play in endowments and philanthropic organizations, foundations, where it's like 95% of the money is invested in things that are damaging communities, damaging the planet, extracting wealth. And then the 5% that they're, obligated to spend towards good works are often going towards trying to ameliorate those exact problems, those social dilemmas, no, social harms that are caused by those investments. So there is this contradiction that you can't really resolve by continuing to keep these things separate. And so just thank you for kind of naming that in your different ways. So pulling out of this extractive system that is a death cult, what do we then reorient towards? And kind of how does that work? Like, can you break it down a little bit in terms of how do we make sure that the resources that we do have control or influence over, how do we reduce the harm that they're making? And what do we do instead? More generally, yeah, we can get into this. There's lots of different buckets I know that we can dig into here.
You want me to jump in, Morgan? You want to jump in? Yeah? Is it okay if I go back to just a few visuals, Sarah?
Yeah, the visuals are helpful.
I think this speaks directly to what Morgan was sharing, which is so much. This is an average retirement portfolio for a 55-year-old in the United States. Most people would look at this and have absolutely no clue what their money is in, right? And I think the reality is if we want to move towards something that is more aware and less extractive, then we have to really grapple with, like we were just talking about, the fact that investing in mutual funds is a very non-transparent process in reality. But if you have a 401k or a 403b or something, most likely, there's very little awareness of any kind of extractive investments that you're inside of. And everything I'm going to share here is an imperfect attempt at trying to move toward a more holistic way of being in relationship with our money. So I just want to name that. None of this is perfect because we are working inside of an imperfect system. But part of what is happening right now is a number of groups are asking, they're working on what we would call direct indexing of funds. So they're saying rather than building these non-transparent bundlings of funds, what if we could directly index things in ways that are accountable to social and environmental movements? What if we could build or we could construct investment options in the public markets that are in more alignment with some of those values? So these are a few groups that are doing that. Adesina Social Capital has an ETF that is available. You could ask your financial advisor about it. That is available to folks who are invested in the public markets. Just Futures is a group, very new group that has recently launched a more socially responsible retirement savings option for organizations. So if you work inside of an organization, you think you may be willing to move toward a different provider, would highly encourage checking them out. But let's say we're on this journey, right, of moving from something that's maybe less extractive, less harmful. We want to really move toward doing even less harm. It's really hard, I would argue, to achieve that inside the context of global multinational corporations and like most publicly traded companies. And so that's where new things come in, like reconsidering our banking relationships. Most for-profit banking options are deeply embedded in the fossil fuel industry. And so you could look into nonprofit banking options. You could look into your local and regional credit unions and understand whether they offer different savings products. Bank for Good is a resource that I've used in the past and that others have used to try and find new banking providers. But there are options that exist of banking institutions that are not quite as steeped in extractive capitalism. So that's one part of the journey. Let's say we want to move then to something that's more for impact investing. And by that, I would refer to for impact investments as investments that do not do harm and that create some sort of social or environmental positive outcome or benefit for community. I think we have some folks from the RSF team here today, so they can tell you much more about this, but there are a number of there's a growing landscape of good funds and projects that are seeking capital. And the reality is, like, I sort of included a range here of options that are available to any individual that have low minimums, some that have higher minimums. The reality is many of these will never be on the radar of your financial advisor. They do not look at these types of options because they are often perceived as being very risky. And the entire industry is steeped in preserving your capital and growing the financial returns on your capital. So even if you insist that they look at options like this, most likely they will not. If you insist on investing either way, they may put it into your portfolio, but then disclaim it from their performance. So it really sort of, behooves us to be in community with one another, growing an awareness of Indigenous-led funds, BIPOC-led funds, these kinds of options that do exist that really center relationality, repair, and impact. I would say that moving from that, and I'm going to invoke our dear friend and soul sister Janelle Orsi here, who's a cartoonist. Many of you know her. She helped start the Sustainable Economies Law Center. She's been very embedded in the Land Justice Futures community, and she provides these like brilliant illustrations of what we're all trying to move toward in a non-extractive economy. And so I just loved this. I wanted to bring this in, but I think part of what it might look like if we move toward a repair-centered way of thinking about our money is to really reckon with the fact that our primary motivation would be non-financial, and that we wouldn't be holding these restorative or reparative efforts to the same standard that we hold enterprises that are a part of degrading our ecosystem, which is so often what happens, right? When we make financial decisions about how to flow capital or how to review options or diligence, we hold them to the same standards, which I think is really awful. And so how do we really reckon with, as was said earlier, the reality that finance actually can be an interesting grounds through which we could explore more relational communal ways of life, where we can look at risk in a much more holistic way. I do just want to say that I think this is hard to do divorced from community. I think part of what's really important is that we reckon with what it means to be living more communally in our lives, such that we can actually think more holistically about these resources and how they could flow.
I'll add just one thought about in our current economy, you hear a lot about inflation. And often, well, I'll say in my family, my dad is really worried that I'm not going to keep up with inflation. There's this phrase, you got to keep up with inflation, otherwise your money's just losing money. And to Elizabeth's last point, something I think about a lot in my own life and work with others is, what are the other ways we are reducing our exposure to inflation? There's the option of like investing extractively so that we're part of the tiny slice of society whose money goes faster than inflation to keep up with accelerating worlds of impact there. Or there's, what are the ways we're working to meet our needs outside of that system entirely? If we're looking at the prices of groceries going up, but we're someone who's part of a community garden, that impacts us less. If we're looking at the price of gas going up and we're part of a vehicle share or a school run or other ways of sharing access to transportation, that impacts us less. If we're looking at the price of housing going up, but we are working with our local community land trust and figuring out how to get housing off of the speculative market, that impacts us less. And so when this idea comes to us of like, oh, well, if you're not making 7%, 10%, you're basically losing money. How do we step back from that assumption and look more holistically at what really are my needs? What really are my family's needs? And are there other ways that we can meet those? And those are also long-term strategic investments in our futures, and take time, energy, creativity, relationality, community, some of the biggest assets that we can be privileged to steward in our lifetimes. And yeah, I think these times require of us to be thinking in that way about how we're going to meet our needs going forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you both. I feel like you both helped illustrate this this question of what is actual security in a time of collapse or a time of devastation. You know, it's knowing that you have other resilient relationships and ways of meeting each other's needs collectively. You have the trust there. You have the relationship there. You're already in a practice of sharing and caring for one another, and kind of removing yourself from a market-based life where, you know, you'll have to compete with the speculative market, you'll have to compete with inflation in order to get by. And so it's actually like, how do we just orient our life within alternatives that center relationship in order to meet our needs, and meet each other's needs, importantly, as well. I think we'll probably get into, I hope we'll get into some more of this like juicy, like what are the assumptions here that we actually just need to unlearn? But I'm wondering, you know, since this is kind of like a 101, what are some like the first steps when people ask you like, well, what should I do? I'm so new to this. What are some of the first steps that you recommend for people in terms of, you know, what do they say when they walk into their bank about what they want to do? And like, how do they start researching alternatives in terms of where their money could go or how they could support the cooperative economy, the solidarity economy, Black and Indigenous owned cooperatives, land trusts, things like that.
Yeah, I just shared in the chat my resource library, which also links to many other resource libraries put together by many smart people, because lots of people are trying to make lists of these things to try and make them more visible and available. From some of the examples that have already been shared to, yeah, looking at what are the places that money can live. And what I'll say to folks is, you know, it can take a while to unlearn or move through some of the what we may have been taught about like risk and return and liquidity and these kind of traditional investment considerations. And so I'll often say to folks, well, what's a practice step? What's an amount of money that you could invest in these things that might be perceived as risky, or your family might perceive them as risky, or your advisor might perceive them as risky? Like, what's an amount you could put in that, say, you could afford to lose? And to just start there and to be like, oh, wow, I put in that amount of money 2 years ago. That investment, let's say it was the Cooperative Fund of the Northeast that supports worker-owned cooperatives in the Northeast of the United States. They send me newsletters about the great things they're doing. And oh, I'm so happy to see that community of folks were able to buy the land underneath their mobile homes. And I'm so happy to see that bakery got to be bought over by its owners. And my money's still there, and they said I can have it back anytime. Maybe I'll put in a little bit more, or maybe I'll choose another option. So to just be like, to not let like the biggest questions of enough and, yeah, transforming our ideas of risk and de-exposing ourselves to inflation and these big ideas we've offered, not needing to let all of those things figure themselves out before taking our first step. And that's kind of on the proactive, like making new investments side. On the divestment side, I'll often just ask folks, like, are you wanting to profit from these things even one more day? And often when people sit with what's really true for them, like, you know, there's a line to be drawn of like, actually, no, like I'm not willing to profit from, say, oil and gas even one more day. Great, like let's sell those stocks now and let's just put that money in your savings account at your credit union while you figure out and learn and get oriented to where it's going to go next. So also not letting the question around, I don't know where it's going to go, prevent us from being like, well, let's take it out while we figure that out. A few first steps.
So good, Morgan. Yeah, just want to echo so much of what you shared. And part of why I find money to be such an interesting lever for these kinds of conversations about our fears and what really matters is because each of us has a money story, right? And often we have a lot of our own inherited traumas, fears, histories, in some cases generational, that we're not even conscious of, that is at work in our lives and in our decision making. And so one thing I do often invite folks into is their own journey work of reflecting on their money story, right? And you can do that. There are people who will accompany Morgan, who will accompany people in that journey work. I've recently been really enjoying doing it as part of a circle of 5 women. We're supporting each other in discerning our own money stories and how they're at play in our lives and what we want to unlearn. This unlearning journey, I think, for me, will probably happen over a full lifetime and possibly beyond. And so I think there are ways in which we can get closer to, well, what are the things we're actually afraid of? Like, what are the real fears here? And they run pretty deep. And so I think this is also an invitation into our own work of transformation. And then part of why I really appreciate working with communities of sisters in particular is because they are rooted in a legacy of thinking counterculturally about money and about resources. And so in addition to all the practical steps that we've talked about in the resources, and we'll share out the slides, and Morgan's document is a total treasure trove, I can attest to that. In addition to all of that, I think there's also really important work to do in community with each other to keep discerning these things. So Francesco Collaborative has a couple of courses that are essentially just walking with community in this journey work of unlearning and then becoming aware of what's possible to do next. So we can share that out too.
Thank you both. I'm curious, I saw a comment or a question in the chat earlier about some of the risks in terms of when we think we're doing good, but it's actually just greenwashing or something like that. I guess as people are taking their first steps or are in the middle of this journey, wherever they are, like what are some of the common pitfalls that people should be aware of, and like what can they look to for guidance around making sure that we don't get lost in the meaning of what we're trying to do with the kind of labels and creative, financial product names that, might be selling us something that we actually don't want to be buying.
So I see very often that many people believe they're in socially responsible funds, and they often carry labels, right? ESG, or an advisor might claim to be something is socially responsible. And I think the invitation is to really consider what is the underlying asset, that these labels are becoming fairly ubiquitous, and there is a very imperfect array of attempts at making things ESG. ESG just stands for environmental, social, and governance considerations or criteria that are often used to build these products, these financial products. And the data surrounding many of those ESG considerations is often quite questionable, right? And so this goes back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of just the lack of transparency undergirding a lot of what's available to us in the public markets, which is where most people have their retirement savings. I think there is a real question for some of us as individuals about whether we could actually just move all of our money out of the public markets. But for many people who have investments there, that is a very common pitfall, that we end up in these ESG funds that are maybe divested of fossil fuels, but actually just invested in big tech. And so there are ways in which I think going a little bit deeper, just clicking a little bit deeper is important. The other thing I would invite us to consider is how we really educate ourselves around this emerging and fast growing space of green capitalism, which is like a number of these financial products that are emerging in the name of sort of natural investment solutions or green, supporting a green economy, and in fact are actually just replicating the status quo system in a lot of ways. There's a book that I'll drop in the chat. It's called The Value of a Whale by Adrian Bowler that I read this year that had a huge impact on me, just really just illuminating a lot of the sort of common pitfalls and mythologies around the world of green capitalism. So I'll share that here.
Yeah, I want to underscore something Elizabeth said earlier around, like, let's say you have an asset manager, investment advisor who's kind of from the mainstream world of finance, as 99.9% of them are, like they don't have relevant training or knowledge or exposure to thinking differently about these things. And often joke with my clients, I'll be like, so is his name Brad or is it John? And it's just, so and then we'll be like, okay, Brad has not yet had the opportunity to learn about these alternatives to the training that he had and to actually allow that to let us come with dignity, that when we're explaining that we want to do something different, that we're coming from like just an entire world of knowledge that Brad has not yet had the opportunity to step towards. And we might choose whether we're forced to by like a relationship with Brad that we have to have based on trusts or institutions, or we're just choosing to stay in it with Brad. We can actually be a doorway towards some of that learning. And I'll say, when I was in my early 20s and I asked my family's financial advisor if I could divest from fossil fuels, years later, he said, "You were the very first person to ask me that. And since then, many people have." And then some years later, when I was like, actually, I'd like to divest from all public markets entirely, he said, "Well, you're the first person to ask me that, but so were you with fossil fuels, and maybe it's going to all go this way," which I appreciated him saying. But yeah, to know that as we interface with those people, that they don't necessarily know everything, and to stand on our own 2 feet in the learning journey that we're on. And that sometimes that does mean being like, okay, thank you. You do your thing, but I'm actually going to do something else entirely and need to move these assets out of your control.
Thank you both. I'd love to spend just the last couple of minutes here. If there's reflections on, as you mentioned, Brad or John, like the worldview that makes Brad or John's work what it is also one that we have often internalized. And I'm curious if there are things that, like, nuggets that have been so critical for you in doing that unlearning, so that you can either say, "Peace out, Brad and John," or "Come with me, Brad and John. We're going over here to the land of cooperative economics and true sustainability and regenerating life." Um, what would you name about risk and return? What would you name about security or growth? Like some of the like the most pervasive underlying assumptions that we actually need to uproot within ourselves in order to reorient towards an economy of life.
I found it really interesting when I learned that like the old English translation of wealth, Wealth, meant the conditions for well-being. And I've been sort of involved in this well-being economy movement in recent years. And I think many folks in that space reflect on, what does the research show are genuine contributors to happiness in our lives? It's generosity and contentment. And our current financial system does nothing to nourish either of those. And so I think there's a real invitation for us to think about culture shifting work here. Pope Francis in Laudate Deum reflected on how there are no lasting changes without cultural changes, without shifting our lifestyles and our convictions. And so, in addition to all the technical fixes that we might engage in to think about how to realign our money with our values, I think we can also show up in our lives in ways that nurture a different story about what a good life really is. And part of what the mythology that continues to undergird a system of extractive capitalism is one that says there's never enough, and that luxury is the thing that we are really most chasing. There's this book that my friend David Cloutier wrote called The Vice of Luxury that I would highly recommend, that really just helps situate ourselves in this cultural context of how we revere luxury over many other things in our sort of dominant cultural narrative. So how do we want to unwind that narrative? How do we want to show up in ways that witness to a countercultural worldview? And that is one that says that there is enough. In fact, there's more than enough. This is what we know from from our ancestors, right? The many that have come before us, that this Mother Earth has given us everything we need and more to thrive. And so how do we unstick ourselves from this narrative of scarcity and hoarding and move toward one of abundance and generosity? So I think that is as much about the practical steps that we take as it is about how we show up to witness to a new story and how we are in relationship with each other.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. I just dropped in the chat Resource Generation's transformative investment principles. Resource Generation is an organization that organizes young people with wealth and class privilege towards redistribution. It's been a political home for me. And yeah, in this manifesto, they talk about, yeah, like risk for who and return to what, and how can we turn some of these ideas inside out and towards justice. And I'm reminded when the word risk comes up of when I was a senior in college at the Ivy League school that I went to, that someone in a career forum said to us, you know, graduating from Dartmouth College, you can afford to take risks more than anyone else, in more than many other people in society. And that was talking about jobs and careers, but it's always stuck with me, this idea of affording to take risks. And what if that was something that we actually brought to our investment choices, to be like, who can afford to shoulder the risk? Because there is risk on the journey to utterly transforming our society, to walking through this just transition to a world that we don't actually know yet, even if we've tasted it. Like, yes, there's beauty and risk on that journey. And who can afford to shoulder the risk? It's the people who are carrying the legacy of too much material resource from the world that we're coming from. And so as we walk forward towards that unknown future, like, let those of us who can take on as much of that risk, because it's worth it. Because the biggest things in life that we want to strive for and go for are beautiful and risky. And like, let's not stand by the wayside while that opportunity is here for us.
Mm. Mm. Thank you both so much. And your words, the words of risk are really sticking with me in this moment of like, we are all facing collective risk, and risk has already been unequally distributed in terms of the externalities that aren't external. They're impacting our world and our communities and our very bodies. But those who have often bore the brunt of the true impact of our economy. What is it to actually share this risk more? And what is it to reassign risk in terms of building the world that we need and deserve, and divesting from the world that poses the largest risk of all to all of us? So that is less articulately put than you just put it, Morgan, but it's really sticking with me as we are in these really uncertain and scary times of like, who is risking now? Who do we need to step up into greater risk? And how do we actually understand our shared interest in life and our shared risk for the status quo? So thank you so much, Morgan and Elizabeth. We are at the end of our power hour. I wish we had more time, but I know that we will probably be returning to this conversation in other ways in the future. Just profound gratitude for your work and for what you've shared here today. If you want to come on and say any last words or say goodbye, and I might invite us, for those who can stay a little bit longer, just to have a closeout of seeing each other's faces and kind of taking in the moment of recognition that is our interconnectedness and the abundance of wealth and the abundance of relationship that we are in, and just really letting that feel wealthy. Yes. So Morgan, Elizabeth, anything else you'd like to say?
Just thank you. Thank you for this work. Thank you to everyone for showing up. And yeah, we can't do this alone. So let's keep reaching for one another.
Well said. I was just gonna say, I'm here, I'm in it, I'm an open book. I can talk about this journey of trying to figure out how to, you know, remove money from extractive sources. And so please reach out. I'm very happy to have a candid conversation on any of this. And yeah, just so appreciative of the like heart of everybody on this call. I feel like everyone here is showing up to really be in service of life. So thank you. I'll drop my email in the chat.
Oh, great. Thank you both. And thank you for being such resources to the movement as well. And this movement too. All right, I'm going to remove these spotlights and maybe we can just have a minute to gaze upon each other as this room of people acknowledging the humanity and abundance that and the world of worlds contained within each of these squares, and sending our well wishes and our prayers for collective well-being and reciprocity in this moment. So I see you and thank you.